Well, thank you, Joanne. I'm Ray Vaughan. I'm a professional geologist and environmental scientist. I've been working on West Valley issues like Joanne has since 1978, always as a private citizen. I'm a member also of the West Valley Citizen Task Force, which advises DOE, U.S. Department of Energy, and NYSERDA. Been on that since 1997. And I will try to move quickly through some of the things I have that are duplicative of Joanne's material. But let me just talk for a second about my complicated title, and I'm going to have a few slides that are a bit complex here. Scoping is an early step, an important early step in the environmental review process, part of an EIS process, environmental impact statement process, that will guide cleanup decisions for the buried waste. That's the decisions coming up in the year 2022. I think Joanne had the unrevised date of 2020, but it's actually the year 2022, 4 years from now. That's the decision on the buried waste that is at the West Valley site. Both the mostly empty but contaminated underground tanks that Joanne showed you the construction picture of, and also the burial grounds that she showed you and was talking about. So scoping, as I say, is an important step toward the EIS process, basically telling the EIS process preparers what they need to include. And the EIS in turn will guide this important decision on buried waste coming up in the year 2022. So as you've already seen from Joanne, the West Valley site was a combination of two things: reprocessing, which was a pretty sophisticated, although didn't work out quite the way they wanted, a lot of technical problems, but it was very complicated, sophisticated in some senses, combined with the trenches, which were pretty crude holes dug in the ground, either the trenches or the so-called special holes that some of the plant waste were buried in. So you've heard a lot of this already from Joanne. The site has pretty much been in standby and cleanup mode now for quite a few decades. The West Valley Demonstration Project Act in the year 1980 was passed by Congress, and that's what brought U.S. Department of Energy on site to help the site owner, which is the state of New York, administered by NYSERDA. And DOE, under the Demonstration Project Act, is responsible for doing part, not all, but part of the cleanup work at the site. The project has been moving along with millions of dollars of annual funding. I think it's always been above $60 million. During the vitrification process, it was up over $100 million per year. It's now back in the neighborhood of 60 to 70 million. A lot of dollars passing through the site. And what's coming up in the year 22 is a decision on whether it's going to be a full cleanup or a partial cleanup. And scoping, as I say, is part of the environmental review process. It's actually the third EIS process. Joanne showed you the chart with the 1996 draft. The other EIS that was about 10 years ago, or 8 years ago, I should say, in the year 2010. And now we're coming up to the phase 2 decision, which is the third of these EIS processes. Full cleanup is estimated to take, or I should say will take, over 100 years at the current funding level. The full cleanup cost is estimated at around $10 billion. That is a lot of money. And I want to emphasize that the money that comes into the community is pretty substantial. So one of the things to keep in mind is that the better cleanup, the more complete cleanup, also brings job and economic opportunity to the community. It's not a reason to be throwing money away. We need to be very careful about how federal and state money is spent. But unlike some environmental issues, I think it's a win-win to do the most complete cleanup here, because it's not pitting jobs against the environment as we sometimes hear about. Everybody's on the same page here, I think, that the more complete cleanup will provide good paying and reasonably safe jobs under the procedures that are currently being practiced at this site over a long period of time. And it's not just the jobs, it's also the spin-off environmental effects with a lot of the materials being sourced and dealt with here by subcontractors. So the question that is very much involved in the scoping and in the later phases of the EIS is whether partial cleanup of the site is going to be adequate. Joanne has already talked to you about the fact that the site is eroding, and I'll give you a little bit more on that. Here are some pictures. Joanne showed you the one of the slumping that's going on. You can see 3 of those pictures here. There's also a picture of a roadway that was damaged in the August 2009 storm. It's no secret that a lot of the glacial till in this area, even though it may be somewhat resistant to grain by grain erosion, is very susceptible to slumping. And when moving water starts moving a lot of the till around, either in slump blocks or smaller pieces, even grains of the till, it can do a lot of rearrangement of the landscape. And that's a serious concern for the buried wastes that are still at the West Valley site that the year 2022 decision will be deciding on. So this, I think you've already seen. You get a sense of the location of the burial grounds relative to the creeks. And you can see here the path of Buttermilk Creek, which carries the water that falls as rainfall on or near the area where the tanks are by the reprocessing plant, and also on or near the plateau is where the burial grounds are located. You've got Franks Creek here, Erdman Brook here. These flow into Buttermilk Creek, then up to Cattaraugus Creek, which, as you know, flows westward, past Galanda through the Seneca Nations, Cattaraugus territory, into Lake Erie. So that is part of the concern about erosion at the site. There is a direct pathway if erosion does carry some of the wastes away. So here's another couple of maps that show pretty much the same thing. You can see on this map, this is where the burial grounds are, this is where the plant is. And here again are Erdman Brook feeding this way, going up northward where we join Buttermilk Creek, which on this map is going to have its confluence with Franks Creek up above the top of the slide here. Franks Creek is on this side of the burial grounds. Here you see the same thing. Here's Franks, here's Erdman Brook. Just to give you a sense that these are creeks that are cut down into the till, into the clay-like till. And the concern is that over the next hundreds and thousands of years, the rainfall, especially accentuated by climate change, is going to enlarge these existing ravines and at some point cut into the existing burial trenches and start to expose and carry away radioactive waste, simply carry it downstream. The question that we have conflicting study results on is how soon. This is the major unresolved question, and the 2 previous EIS studies came to very different results on this. One suggested it was a very severe problem that would occur within the next few hundred years. The other basically said, no big deal, it's not going to happen anytime soon. But we can certainly see, based on the August 2009 storm and other events, that erosion is not a trivial issue. At some point, we just don't know how far in the future, at some point the West Valley buried wastes will become a problem to people downstream if they're not removed. Joanne showed you a different version of this. This is what the satellite view of the erosion plume from the August 2009 storm looked like. What you're seeing is simply clay particles. You're not seeing any radioactive contamination because there was little or no radioactive contamination carried downstream in this storm. But the plume serves as a good tracer for where anything that goes into Cattaraugus Creek and its tributaries, such as Buttermilk Creek and Franks Creek, will end up. So on this map you can see, in case you couldn't on the previous one, just what's where. You can see Cattaraugus Creek here, which was the area primarily affected by the August 2009 storm. Buffalo and the rest of Erie County and the western New York got much less rainfall in that event than the Cattaraugus Creek watershed did. But you can perhaps see the plume of sediment deviating a little bit from the shore here, but mostly just hugging the shore, coming up past Buffalo through the Niagara River. This is a somewhat different view from what Joanne showed you. You can see on this particular day it was looping around after it came out into Lake Ontario. So this, as I say, is a good tracer or a surrogate for both past deposition, as studied, for example, by a Canadian scientist named Joshi, who identified the radionuclides in Lake Ontario from the West Valley site a couple of decades ago. Or it's a good tracer for what future plumes of radioactivity will do, what their path will be as they move downstream. So moving on to scoping issues. And when I talk about scoping issues, I'm talking about comments that I hope you will consider submitting. These are basically recommendations on things that the two agencies should include in the EIS that will guide their 2022 decision on the buried wastes. So, looking at the second paragraph, a lot of dense text here, but let me emphasize what's important. The EIS is going to look at different alternatives, including full removal of buried waste, digging up and removing it all, or leaving the buried wastes where they are. The plan is that they would be stabilized in place. The question then is whether they could be truly stabilized or whether the erosion that is coming at some point down the road will eat around the edges and gradually eat out the centers of the burial grounds. That can't very well be called stabilized, but that will be one of the alternatives that's looked at. The EIS is also, the people who are preparing the EIS are also talking about including partial exhumation or partial removal alternatives. And you, as possible commenters on the scope, should think about whether you think this is a good idea. Should the EIS cover partial removal as one of the alternatives they look at? The idea would be that DOE and NYSERDA would identify what they think are the most dangerous portions of the burial trenches based on old records, dig those up, remove them, but leave the other parts intact, with the idea that some of the remaining waste could be left in the ground to decay in place. Again, over time, some of that waste that's left behind, even though it's considered less dangerous, may end up going downstream. But that is one of the scoping issues that you might consider, whether partial removal should be one of the alternatives looked at. The EIS will also look at impacts of the various alternatives. In other words, what are the effects of going this way or that way with this alternative or that alternative? So in looking at the impacts of the different alternatives, they're going to be comparing them to the radiological dose limit of about 25 milligrams per year and deciding, will any person be exposed to more than that? If so, they've got a problem. They would probably not be able to go with that alternative. So they'd be looking for alternatives that would allow them to meet this 25 milligram per year dose standard. But there's some alternatives that may meet that standard, yet may result in downstream water in Cattaraugus Creek, in Lake Erie, and affecting the Buffalo waterfront and moving down to the Niagara River. There may be some of the alternatives that will meet the 25 milligram per year standard, but will leave or may cause quite measurable radioactivity far above background to be flowing through the creeks, through the lake, affecting human activities. So one of the questions that I think I will be commenting on is whether having a stream of radioactivity passing down through creeks that I enjoy, through a lake that I enjoy, would affect what is called community character. That's a phrase of two words that comes out of the New York State Environmental Review regulations. would community character be affected by any of the alternatives being considered? So I would invite you to think about whether community character in your community or community that you have some interaction with would be affected by having radioactivity in the water that you enjoy or use, even though it may not trigger the 25 milligram per year human exposure standard. There's also the question of whether leaving waste on site would hinder reuse of the site. Let me just come back for a second to community character. Some of the things that I think of, for example, are if waste are left on site, I believe, based on what I hear from people I know in Ashford and West Valley, that they would continue to face this stigma of having radioactive waste within their township. This, as I understand, has been a problem for many years in attracting residents, in attracting industry. I believe that Ashford would now like to have this waste be gone. Or alternatively, I think there may be, and Todd Gates can speak to this, there may be concerns from the Seneca Nation about having measurably radioactive water passing through their Cattaraugus territory in Cattaraugus Creek. So this is again a possible example of something that would affect community character. And as Joanne mentioned, the City of Buffalo has spent a lot of money and has been very successful in making the waterfront in Buffalo a place to be, both for local residents and for people from out of town. I think that community character there would be very much affected if local residents and people from out of town learned that the water they were coming to enjoy was radioactive, even if it did not exceed the 25 milligram per year standard. So I think these are some of the things that community character comments might look at. But if you are in a different community, maybe you can think of ways that you might have some effects. And I don't necessarily mean to prejudge what you're going to think on this. You may somehow think there's some benefits as well. I wouldn't think so, but that's up to you. But leaving waste on site may also affect the ability of the town of Ashford to reuse the site. There's an ongoing concern about the roughly 5 square miles, the 3,300 acres that are off the tax rolls. Could that property be productively reused? So just summing up, the scoping comments don't need to be technical like I'm talking about. They can be long or short, simple or complicated. But I hope all of you will consider submitting comments. You can do so at the 3 meetings that are coming up. One in West Valley, one in Buffalo, one on the Seneca Nation's Cattaraugus territory. But you can also submit written comments either by mail or by email, and I think there's one other way that you can see. I hope what Charlie brought is, and Diana brought, will provide the information on how you do these. So as I've been talking about the scope, and talk about alternatives that need to be considered, including full removal, no removal at all, or partial removal. We can also include the impacts that need to be considered. For example, is it enough just to look at the radiological limit of 25 milligrams per year? Or are there other, perhaps less tangible things like radioactivity moving through our waterways? And if you're inclined to be technical, you can get into things like what are the impact analysis methods? Are they being done properly? And for example, is climate change being worked into the models that are being used to predict or project future erosion? These are all possibilities. As I say, just any simple comment is better than none at all, so please do consider commenting. And just to reiterate the 2 that I mentioned before, in terms of alternatives, should partial removal be one of them? That's something that I think is up in the air and needs to have some comment. And if buried waste are left in the ground, will this have an impact, positive or negative, on community character or on productive reuse of the site? So thank you very much for your time, and I think Charlie Bowman is on next. Thank you. One more thing. When you make comments, As a matter of courtesy, consider referring to the West Valley site as opposed to West Valley. Part of the stigma that the unincorporated village of West Valley faces is the indiscriminate use of the term West Valley to refer either to where they live or to the site. So do think about using the term West Valley site. It throws in an extra word. It does help in protecting the reputation of the people who live in the hamlet of West Valley, about 2 miles south, upstream. So, fortunately they're upstream, but do think about that. Thanks.
Okay, I hope that we could pull up Charlie Bowman's slide, just showing the aquifer and the Allegheny River. But I wanted to pull the two together for you before we open this up for questions. From the aquifer that Charlie showed, the 325 square mile aquifer is known as the Cattaraugus Creek Basin aquifer. And it sits inside the Greater Niagara watershed. And then, of course, you see that it borders, the reservation is in it, and also West Valley is in it. It's the second most important and second largest sole source aquifer in New York State. The first one is on Long Island. And why is ours so important, and what makes it a sole source aquifer means that over 50% of the residents within that miles get all of their drinking water from an aquifer. So when you think about that, this whole area with Cattaraugus as its backbone, as it were, and going straight through the Seneca Nation territory there, this is where over 50% and closer to 75% out in our rural areas get all of our water. We're on wells, all right? And I'm sure many of you are too. But then what President Gates is speaking about is down in Pennsylvania, in Coudersport, a company, JKLM, related to our wonderful Buffalo Bills owner, Pegula, and Epiphany are planning to build a facility to dump fracking wastewater in Pennsylvania in Coudersport. And of course we know how the Allegheny goes up. It goes up into New York, and then through the reservation, directly downstream from it, then the Kinswood Dam, but it continues on to flow into the Ohio, and then also, of course, Mississippi. This area is called, where Coudersport is called the Triple Divide, and there's a wonderful documentary on this. Triple Divide happens when you have continental divides, and we happen to have one right about 15 miles east of Coudersport in Pennsylvania, in fracking country. In the Triple Divide, the water heads north with the Genesee, heads east over to the eastern seaboard with tributaries to the Susquehanna, and then heads west with the Allegheny River. That supplies, not solely, but is very instrumental in almost a third of this nation's drinking water. And Pennsylvania sits in Pennsylvania, and fracking, high fracking activity happening there, and then also, of course, this wanting to dump into the rivers. So that's something to talk about to President Gates. There's also a Facebook site called Defend Ohio, OHIYO, and then there's also a website called Save the Allegheny. That's an issue that's happening right now and that we are actively helping. And Sierra Club, I know, is in on that. But just with that slide, okay, here we go. This slide is, of course, the sole source aquifer, West Valley Ashford. Then you have the Allegheny down here, and the Google Earth one that Charlie showed, it just showed how much water, how much fresh water. New York State has a very great reputation for fresh drinkable water and very porous soils. We have till, we have something called, how many people have been, of course, Camisaroli or the Gorge or Letchworth. We have something called Devonian Shale, which is just, obviously that's what they're trying to get the natural gas out of, but at the same time is what makes up our geology. So do talk with any of our speakers after this, and also I do encourage you to check in at the NiagaraSierraClub.com, or if you want to learn more about Counter Sport, you can go to Defend Ohio, O-H-I-Y-O, or you can also go to Safety Allegheny. We do ask that if you would like to make a comment, you can do it basically one of 4 ways. You can show up at the scoping hearing, and you do need to register for that. That information is on your paper. You can go online. That information is also on the handout. You can write something and mail it in, or you can just simply speak at the hearing. But if you would like to write something, and if you wanted to write now, we can also mail it in. We have more postcards if you wanted to write a comment. Last time they had these hearings, they received 1,900 comments. Now, we would like to beat that. So in any way that you can comment as often as you like, and there are many ways to do it. Do we have any questions right now before we break? Okay, well, all of our speakers are going to be right in there, so you can talk to them one-on-one. Thank you very much for your interest. Please pass on the word. We did film it, and we'll let you know. If you leave us your email, phone number, however you'd like to be contacted, on one of those cards, you can hand it to me or bring it right to where the coffee is here. And we also have pulled pork, and we've got Timbits from Tim Hortons. So if you, or if you're staying in the area, there's some great restaurants. Ask me before you go home if you've traveled. Well, there's some very good restaurants right within walking distance. But we'd also like to thank not only our speakers, but also Kevin for your technical. He's from the Springville Center for the Arts, and of course Springville Center for the Arts.